It's just like a conversation with us five.
That's right. There was some interest around here. I've publicized it through the state of Rhode Island climate agency list, and then some through my Brown University lists and so on. So hopefully some of those people are out there watching. Can't really tell, but somebody maybe can tell.
Yeah. So should we get started, or yeah?
Sure.
All right. Well, so everyone, I hope you've all have had a great Earth Day so far and have gotten outside. I wanted to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our panel discussion about renewable energy on Indigenous land. My name is Emma Ardington, and I'm the AmeriCorps Vista worker for the College of Menominee Nation Sustainable Development Institute. I'll be co-moderating this discussion with my coworker, Jasmine Miosh. Jasmine is a student at the College of Menominee Nation and the Climate Change and Tribes Research Assistant for the Sustainable Development Institute. And we have three amazing panelists joining us today: Kelly Jackson from Sunvest Solar, Dr. J. Timmons Roberts from Brown University, and Gregory Hitch from Minneconnicum Community Builders and also Brown University. Before we get into our question and answer segment, can you guys all go around and give us a little introduction to yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about your work and research?
So who's going first, Emma? Do you want me to start off? You have to call
Whoever. Oh, I have to call. All right, you can go ahead.
traffic cop, as they say. So first of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me. I think this is a very exciting and very important event. And I look forward to the discussion because I'm going to learn a lot, that's for sure. I'm a professor at Brown University, where I've been for 11 years now. Before that, I was at a college in Virginia, William and Mary, at Tulane University, and received a PhD at Johns Hopkins University. I've been working on climate change for about 30 years, since about 1991. And for a long time, I was very interested in climate justice issues between the wealthy countries and the poor countries, and how they hash that out at the United Nations negotiations, and really why the system was so unjust, and in terms of who's causing the problem of climate change, and who's actually doing something about it, and who's actually suffering the impacts. So that was about 20 years of work right there. And I would bring students along with me in my climate and development lab, which I created with two colleagues at Brown about 10 years ago. And I would bring them to the UN negotiations, and we would work in partnership with organizations, research institutes, nonprofits, advocacy organizations, government organizations, intergovernmental groups, and then we also helped provide support for the poorest countries in the world, the least developed countries group. About 3 years ago, I decided that there was no reason for us to be going to the UN negotiations because our president had withdrawn from the only global treaty, the Paris Agreement. And so I decided to bring the struggle back home, as it were. And so since then, I've really shifted my entire lab's research agenda and our engagement to work on climate denial and understanding this very complex network that's working to deny the reality of climate change and delay our country's action on this. And really, the United States is so important globally that the world has struggled for 30 years to come to meaningful agreements on this issue. I would say largely because our country is failing to lead. We've been really dragging the whole system down for all this time. So I have lots more to say, as you can tell, but this what gets me up in the morning is trying to make a difference on climate change. So this is, I think, anyway, and Indigenous communities are a really important part of this. So thanks.
Yeah. So Kelly, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. First of all, I want to say the same. Emma, Jasmine, thank you very much. It's an honor to be on the panel today. Obviously, both Gregory and Tim have some amazing things to contribute. I can't wait to hear more about the work that you guys have been doing. I actually am a tribal member from Melac Flambeau, my background primarily is in environmental, cultural resource, intergovernmental affairs. So I've, shared a significant amount of time working with tribes across the country in sort of environmental, cultural resource preservation. Most recently joined a team of amazing renewable energy advocates and experts at my new home now, which is Sunvest Solar. We are one of the largest solar developers in the Midwest. We also have some incredible stories and projects that we've carried out in Indian country across the US. So I'm excited to share some of those barriers and challenges that we've been able to address as a company, but also looking forward to share a little bit about some of the unique and innovative community approaches that we've used to deploy solar across tribal communities. And so I'm looking forward to this session, and I appreciate again the invitation to participate. And happy Earth Day.
Yeah, awesome. All right, Greg, you want to wrap it up?
Sure, yeah. So I also want to thank you all, Emma and Jasmine, for having me, and Kelly and Timmons is excited to share this panel with you. So I'm a PhD candidate in American Studies at Brown University, and I'm actually also a volunteer at Mitigation, a Menominee community nonprofit focused on cultural revitalization and environmental justice. And I've really been volunteering with them while I've been doing my field work here in the Menominee community. So I actually grew up on ancestral Menominee lands as a settler in what is now known as Green Bay. So it was really great to be able to work with the Menominee community. And yeah, so some of my areas of focus in teaching are in environmental justice, Indigenous studies, environmental history, and science and technology studies. So one of my more recent projects before I started doing my dissertation research was focusing on the use of drones by the water protectors at Standing Rock and how they were used to sort of surveil the police and just show the world all the police violence and also the beauty of the landscape and the water that was at stake. So I curated an exhibit at Brown with Adrian Keene, and we also recently published a photo essay about that topic in EduFacts, this awesome online journal that comes out of UW-Madison. So yeah, so my research project is called The Forest Keepers, an Environmental History of the Menominee Nation from Colonization to Climate Change. And it's really sort of investigating how European and American settler colonialism, capitalism, and now climate change have disrupted Menominee relationships with the land, waterways, and ecosystems of the Western Great Lakes region. And I really want to illustrate how the Menominee have had all these various ways in the past and present to fight back against these injustices and found creative ways to remain on their ancestral lands and retain their lifeways. So using archival and ethnographic methods, I tell a story of Menominee survival, adaptation, and resurgence through their historical and contemporary struggles for environmental and climate justice. So I really want to talk about also how research should be reciprocal too when you're working with Indigenous communities. And so I have really consciously tried to develop a research project that has reciprocity at the center of it. So reciprocity is usually defined, at least in my experience working with the Menominee, as sort of mutual care, respect, and equitable conduct between persons, both human and more than human. So I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't repeating the past injustices that white guys like me have done. So I wanted this research project to be different. So that's why I've been working with Miniconic and the Sustainable Development Institute to develop this research project. And I've also headed up the solar initiative at Miniconic, which I think I'll be talking about a little bit more later. So thank you for having me. Happy Earth Day. I'm excited for the panel.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, I want to thank you all for joining us today. And making this happen. It's a great Earth Day discussion to have, especially now. So I just want to iterate before we get started. This discussion is mainly for our audience. So if you guys out there listening have any questions you want our panelists to answer, please feel free to send them in. Yeah, and so with that, I'll get started asking our first questions. So this one's mainly for Dr. Roberts, but honestly, anyone else can answer too. This is not like a strict thing. Okay, so what is climate change and how does renewable energy play a role in climate change mitigation?
Thanks, Emma. I was actually hoping we'd hear Jasmine introduce herself too. Can you do that?
Oh yeah, for sure. Jasmine, go right ahead.
Love to hear. Hello.
My name is Jasmine Niash. I'm a student at the College of Menominee, as well as the Climate Change and Tribes Research Assistant here at the Sustainable Development Institute. I have a degree in natural resources and I'm working on my public administration degree right now. And I'll also be on the technical side, taking everybody's questions. So if you have anything you'd like to chime in, feel free to do so on either our Facebook or here on the Zoom chat. There's a Q&A section. So thank you all for joining us.
Thanks. I'm so glad to get to hear a little more about you. So I guess I'm kind of the generalist to get this started. I guess the first thing I was asked, thank you, Emma, for the great questions, are sort of what's climate change, and then what does renewable energy play a role in addressing climate change? So the simplest explanation of climate change is that we're sort of adding blankets to the bed of the Earth's atmosphere, that as we move more of this, especially fossil fuel carbon, the stuff that was laid down hundreds of millions of years ago in the fossil layers down under the, in the ground, and then pump it up and then burn it or dig it up in terms of coal, we're launching all this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Or even worse, we're leaking the methane, which is 86 times worse than carbon dioxide per unit in terms of the number of blankets we're putting on this bed. I mean, you put enough blankets on a bed and you can't sleep in it anymore. And the global system, before industrialization, was at a very steady level, remarkably steady level of carbon in the atmosphere, which coincided with the rise of our civilizations. And now we're messing with it by pumping all this stuff up, digging it up, and burning it. So that's kind of the simplest thing. I mean, climate change is, resulting in increased heat waves. The global average temperature is going up, but especially in certain parts of the Earth, the Arctic, in sub-Saharan Africa, there's parts of the world that are, marginally inhabitable, very tough to live on because they're so arid. Semi-arid places are becoming desertified. We have increased heat waves, which are extremely problematic in the hotter parts of the country and the world, including downtown in cities, in inner cities where there's very little vegetative cover. Trees serve to cool neighborhoods. They actually reduce the pollution. They actually sweat in a way that cools the whole area. And if you're in a place with black roofs and black asphalt around you, those places warm up during the day and they just don't cool down at night, and they just get worse and worse. Droughts are getting worse. So what we're often having is sort of periods of longer droughts and then more intense rainfall. The rainfall then can mean intense flooding, which is because the warmer air holds more moisture. We're getting these intense hurricanes and increased storminess and so on. There's all kinds of impacts. Sea levels are rising, wildfires are getting worse, and on and on. And we just don't really know what we're doing here. That is, we don't know where the tipping points are in terms of how much of these carbon we're pumping out of the ground and digging up and burning, how much before we really head over these points where the planet becomes uninhabitable, and especially certain parts of it. I also want to acknowledge that all these sort of physical changes are happening over a landscape of human beings, which is incredibly unequal. And that is that some people are much less able to prepare for, to deal with, and then recover from these disasters, climate disasters. And it's often related to ethnicity and poverty and gender, ability, position in the global economy, all kinds of things that are determining who's suffering worst and first from climate change. So happy to talk more about that in general, but that's the sort of the big picture of why we should care about this, why making this transition away from fossil fuels is so urgent. I mean, the latest report of the global consensus of scientists, at least the mainstream of science, the vast majority of scientists are showing that we, in order to stay within what is thought to be a safe level, we need to cut our emissions, how much of this stuff we're burning, in half by the end of this decade. So we're now down to 9.5 years, and then and basically stop burning the stuff by 2050. So just 30 years from now. And that's extremely fast. I mean, the amount of emissions that we've seen drop this year already because of the COVID lockdown, and I want to acknowledge how much of a hardship and really terrifying event that is, and how this has not necessarily been good, that, it's, some of the Earth's systems are getting a tiny break, but the amount of emissions reductions we're seeing this year are only the amount that we really need to be reducing every year. I mean, that amount we need to keep dropping by about 6% a year, which is far, far more than we ever have, far more. So I want to also say that it's possible for us to do this. That sounds overwhelming, but it's possible. We did some modeling here in Rhode Island with the Stockholm Environment Institute and found that we could reduce 80% of our emissions in just 10 years by doing a huge push on energy efficiency to stop this waste of all this precious fossil fuels and of energy in general, and then switch to renewable energy very quickly. And the things that we have here are especially offshore wind. We have some solar and then a little bit of onshore wind where it could be sited, but in general, we're looking at offshore wind and then connecting to other places for sort of sharing energy so that it's a more stable system, and then looking to build some storage, some ways to store that energy from the times when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. So there are a few other kinds of renewable energy besides solar and wind. There's hydroelectricity, which of course we have some big hydro out there, which has its own environmental impacts. All of these, I want to also acknowledge the environmental impacts of all the forms of renewable energy. In general, they require mining materials to build, for example, solar panels or wind turbines. They require transporting that raw material, manufacturing it into renewable energy sources like solar panels and wind turbines. There's also impacts from siting those things on land or in the water. All those things have impacts which are really important. There's the impacts of developing the electricity grid to connect these things to where the human beings are. And then there's also the disposal of these things after they become no longer useful, the disposal of, for example, solar panels. What I don't want us to get stuck on, though, is that these are all the same. Some of them are worse than others. You can do almost any of these types of renewable energy well, or you can do them badly. And there's clear examples of all of those. And for example, here in Rhode Island, there's a case of a solar farm being put in a place where they had to clear forests and level a huge area of land and have really nasty impacts on that land. So anyway, there's ways to do this well, and there's ways to do it badly. I think I do want to acknowledge some other things like geothermal energy, that there's a lot that's available with drilling pipes near buildings and then using the 55 degrees Fahrenheit temperature underground to sort of pre-cool water or whatever you're circulating through the system and have that run through houses, buildings for heating and cooling. That can really drop the amount of demand of a load and make it a lot easier for us in the future to heat and cool buildings. There's a bunch of other great ideas out there. I mean, the main idea is that we need to switch from gasoline-powered cars and other vehicles to electric vehicles. We need to make our houses run on these heat pumps, whether they're sourced through that geothermal energy or more likely through air-sourced heat pumps, sort of like the opposite of a refrigerator, which take for example, the heat out of the air, the ambient air, and then use that to heat the house. So what else can I say? There's much more to talk about, but let's keep this moving along, and I'll come back to this stuff later. How's that?
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Climate change is such a huge, complicated thing. It's nice to hear it all condensed into one short little explanation. So yeah, speaking of talking about renewable energy and all the different kinds of renewable energy, I have a question about energy sovereignty. Kind of you hear about energy sovereignty, but I didn't know what it was until, I don't know, a few weeks ago. But so what is energy sovereignty, and what does that mean for energy projects on native land? And is this an issue of climate justice, or what do we got? And this is for everyone, so anyone feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I can start. I think energy sovereignty, for me, I've been really trying to define it myself, and I'm sort of in the middle of defining it as I'm doing my research. But I really think it's about increasing political and economic power in Native communities by being energy self-sufficient in a way that comports with their ethical frameworks of those specific communities, while ensuring that ancestral life ways of like hunting, fishing, gathering, other things can continue. So I think that's part of it. I also think a big part of it is that we need to stop sending so much of this needed revenue out of the communities to outside utilities, and keep that money sort of circulating in the local economy. So yeah, and I do want to acknowledge that I think Indigenous communities are, one of those communities that Timmons mentioned that are being impacted first and worst by this. So I think that climate change is, this is really an issue of environmental justice for Native communities. But I also agree that, Native communities shouldn't have to burden the transition to renewable energy, because they've done so little to create the problem. But renewable energy in Indigenous communities does present this really great opportunity. So a recent study showed that about 14.2% of Native-owned households on reservations don't actually have access to electricity. So these are in usually really rural or places far out. And I believe that if these people want electricity, they should have it as a human right. And renewable energy is a good way to do it. So, the U.S. government actually, forced Native communities onto these reservations because they were sort of perceived as wastelands, right? But they actually had huge wind. They have huge wind and solar potential. So some of the ways that this can be rolled out is through small scale solar and wind with battery storage. Those are cost-effective ways to bring electricity to isolated communities, since power lines are expensive and can be really inefficient. So that's a good way to bring that electricity out to these communities. Also, solar and wind-powered microgrids can provide electricity to rural reservation communities potentially at a lower price over the long term than trying to string power lines out to them. But I also think this is a huge economic opportunity, right? Like they could provide good paying jobs building and maintaining utility scale solar and wind projects to meet the needs on the reservation, while also potentially selling clean electricity off the reservation. So I think it's really important, though, that we not repeat the past injustices of extracting energy from Native communities and sending it somewhere else, right? Because this has already been done before in places like the Navajo Nation, where all the coal mining and all these power plants that are polluting their community is just providing electricity for places like Phoenix and LA, right? So that's like externalizing the pollution costs over to the Navajo community. So we need to make sure that we're not just extracting energy in an unjust way. So the way that I think, and I can't wait to hear what everyone else says about this, but one of the ways is that it needs to be sort of federally funded and locally planned, controlled, and managed. So, this isn't a handout either. We got to think about this as, this federal funding ought to be considered an extension of treaty obligations for all the unjust treaties that that Indigenous communities had to deal with. So, this could come in the form of a Green New Deal or a significant increase in Department of Energy grants, that are simple to apply for and not overly burdensome. Since a lot of the folks working in tribal governments are generally stretched pretty thin with the work that they're already doing. So those are just some thoughts that I had, and I'd love to hear what everyone else has to say.
Well, Gregory, I think you did a great job talking about energy sovereignty and just the general application and what tribes are thinking. I think from my experience working in solar, every tribal community is vastly different from one another in terms of their renewable energy goals and their concepts about stewardships of the land and environment while trying to create some delicate balance between economic advancement. So I think, no matter where you are in Indian country, it's very different conversation at every table. So I liked how you touched on, the fact that it is this general sense of having the ownership and control over the energy assets that are in tribal communities and being able to distribute that in whatever way works for a tribal government, whatever way it advances their goals. So I think that's really important. I found myself in the beginning when I was just starting to work with tribes in solar, a lot of times tribes were talking about energy sovereignty from an ability to operate off grid and having access to the distribution of power to their various community buildings and residents. But when you start looking at the economics of that and whether or not it's viable at this point in time for some of the Midwestern tribes, it became very clear that while the goal is to have an economic balance, tribes were more interested in the balance of applying energy independence off grid, which in the world of business or economics doesn't always work out. So some things don't pencil out. And so the assets that you talked about, like the Department of Energy grants, those grants that are giving tribes the ability to, further out or pencil out projects that wouldn't otherwise economically be viable. So independence is, again, I think, and sovereignty is about an individual tribe's perspective on what that process is going to look like. And I think it's really important that, at some point we're going to talk about that, but it's really important that tribes start looking at that plan and start talking about how do you start, examining your energy assets and how can you look at the resources or incentives that can build you a bridge closer to getting to energy sovereignty or independence. But I did like your remarks, Gregory, and I certainly think that Dr. Roberts may have other things to add. I from my experience, feel like it's just diverse depending upon where you are in the world.
I actually have a question for you, Kelly, and that is, I just wanted to agree, first of all, with Greg's point about how Indigenous communities shouldn't have to do this, but that there are great opportunities for local control and breaking this sort of dependency on all the money being spent on fossil fuels. Given the real fuel poverty, how much of family budgets are being spent on reservations and in Indigenous communities in general on fuel, on keeping the house warm, on keeping the truck or the car or the snowmobile or tractor or whatever running. So I wanted to hear more about how does it usually work with renewable installations in terms of local control and ownership. I mean, are they owned or are they leased, for example, on solar installations? And then who ends up doing the labor and the installation and the management and the maintenance and so on? How does that end up going? Have you had success stories or some that really went well or some that could have been better and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. A confession. I worked in workforce development prior to joining the team at Sunvest. I worked for the state of Wisconsin. We did everything from business and economic advancement for tribal individuals and tribal communities. So when I came on board back in February, I was really thrilled to see a lot of the projects that we were integrating into tribal community solar always included an element of workforce development and training. And so the installations sometimes included other tribal members being trained for the O&M, the operation and maintenance of those systems. Also just the actual installation and trying to train tribal members in the installation and application of renewable energy. I'm sure that you are aware that there are some labor shortages in terms of having access to installers, and it's a fast and vastly growing industry. So we really do want to see more individuals pursuing careers in renewable energy. And I think, you know, our owner has been very supportive of looking at ways that we can encourage access to training, certification, and programs that further our labor force. So without a doubt, our projects have included workforce development. But one thing I just want to back up a little bit and say, I think, you know, solar in general or renewable energy in general starts, number one, first with conversations with the community, tribal leadership, tribal programs, and even tribal businesses that are operating within tribal communities. And that conversation really starts out with, let's look at what all of the opportunities that come with each renewable energy application, whether it be wind, solar, you know, bio digesters, it be, you know, geothermal, all of those assets are opportunities. And I think those conversations really sort of provoke not just the level of installation and management, but how do you create a stronger community ethic? And that includes education, not just for program managers or operation and maintenance, but the community itself having more of an environmental consciousness of how to, like you mentioned, Dr. Roberts, is actually having or doing a project in the right way. How do you make sure you're taking into consideration all of the impacts that this particular effort might you know, reveal? So that's the first, is that you get to start talking about building a community ethic. And then the next step is, you know, really looking at, you know, what's the viability, the feasibility, what is our consumption? And you mentioned, like, you know, what is the tribe as a whole using in the utility market? How much are we spending every year on utilities? Because I think that surprises a lot of our clients when we start to lay out, look at your utility costs over a 12-month period. As a matter of fact, Emma and I just worked on looking at the College of Menominee Nation and all of the utility costs for each of those buildings. That's just electricity. So it comes down to, let's talk about what we're actually consuming. Number one, how do you create an ethic to reduce that without even talking about renewable energy? Because I think that needs to come first. I think you need to start having a conversation about how do you reduce your consumption. And that is an individual, you know, application. And each individual community member needs to be invested in that. The third part of that is really looking at the cost benefit and whether or not it's going to be a viable project that will, number one, create energy savings and efficiency, but also in the long term, provide some advantages for the tribes to, you know, offload the extra power that's created in a way that's economically is an economic advantage to the tribe. So with that being said, you know, it's a long answer to, you know, and we've done some great projects. So yes, one of our, you know, prize project is Spokane, Washington. We did a project in partnership with the Spokane tribe called Children of the Sun. That project was a community, public, private, and nonprofit partnership where we were able to look at developing individual residential solar applications and solar arrays on tribal community buildings, not just to reduce the energy, but to also start looking at the future when Spokane was cut off from the rest of the world and was forced to, you know, live and thrive without having access to electricity. It became very clear their community wanted to start getting themselves closer to that energy sovereignty we were talking about. And with that project came a partnership with Grid Alternatives, which is a nonprofit organization that focuses on workforce development for tribes. So the installation and training was actually carried out by tribal members from various communities. In addition to that, it also had a private partnership where we had the tribe's ability to monetize the tax credit that otherwise is not available to tribes. And so that monetarily became an asset that the Spokane tribe was able to capitalize on. In addition to that, there's also a lot of community education, a lot of celebrating. So the solar, once it was, you know, deployed, it wasn't just finished and done. It was, how do we share this asset with the community to be able to actually see what is the savings how is this really impacting our community, and letting that be a regular part of the conversation. So that was a really great collective project that kind of touched on all those layers that you mentioned.
Thanks.
I was super excited to hear about your Spokane project. You talked about it before and I never asked, but now I know. So we have a question from one of our listeners online that also ties into one of my questions that I had. So what are some barriers for energy development on tribal lands, specifically if you could touch on working with local governments?
Well, I know one of the largest barriers, and all of us have sort of talked about it, is there's clearly an economic barrier. Tribes oftentimes are utilizing very limited resources just to sustain the infrastructure that supports the communities right now. So pulling those assets and applying them to a renewable energy project can, number one, be very daunting. And so I think even though solar energy, for example, has become far more affordable, you're going to see a ton more in the Midwest deployed both by utility companies, residents, and companies, commercial companies, because it's much more affordable than it ever has been in the past. And it also is extremely efficient and reliable. So it's one of those resources, renewable energy, that you really just need the space and the sunshine to apply it. It's pretty predictable in terms of the weather, at least historically over the last decade. So we're able to sort of model out what those energy predictions are. But I think the biggest barrier is the economics and whether or not it fits into the goals of a tribe. The third, of course, or the second barrier, I would say, is the utility companies themselves. So when we talk about energy, and solar energy particularly, it really is contingent. The size, the scale, the availability of that source really relies on whether or not the utility companies are supporting a large sizable project. So there's net metering, which basically just means solar power creates power during the daytime when the sun is running. So if you're not using the power as it's being created, you sort of putting power back on the grid, and the energy company is either compensating you for that, or you're storing that energy to use later. And so if the utility company has a net metering policy that says you can only put 20 kilowatts of solar power and we'll give you that credit, so whenever you're creating energy and that meter is running backwards, you're going to get a credit. Anything over 20 kilowatts, for example, you won't get a credit, or you will, but it'll be such a reduced rate, it's economically not going to be an advantage for you. So I think that the other barrier is really working with utility companies. And there are a few tribes out there that are creating their own utility corporations, where they're becoming, again, that energy sovereignty model. So there are some ways to tackle that barrier. And finally is just having the technical expertise and access without putting a large amount of money into feasibility studies and those sorts of things. So there are a few resources that are available, particularly in the Midwest. There's MTERA, which is the Midwest Tribal Energy Resource Association. It's providing some great feasibility research and technical expertise to tribes. It's really important having a viable project. There's a lot of developers out there who are looking at, innovative projects, who are also providing technical assistance at either a reduced or next to nothing cost. I think technical experts. And then finally, just, I think you guys touched on it, is stewardship, versus, the viability of a project. So there's a barrier in the ability to really exercise energy sovereignty when, the cost of storage is so high in the Midwest that it makes it very difficult to, get through a viable project, even though that may be the goal of the tribe. So in my perspective, those are a few of the barriers that we've had to tackle with solar. And I could probably go on, but I certainly think other panelists have an opportunity to share other barriers.
No, I think you hit it pretty well there. I saw that there was a comment, though, that I thought would be interesting to talk about on the chat, and that's someone mentioned that there's a huge renewable energy asset in the Menominee community, which is the Wolf River, and whether or not hydropower is a good choice. So, most hydropower in the past was pretty destructive, right? It was these large-scale dams, some of them even smaller-scale ones that have ruined fish runs. For instance, the dam in Shawano stopped the sturgeon from swimming up the Wolf River. So I don't think that's the way we want to go, but there are options for low impact hydro, and that's something I have heard some people in the Menominee community talking about is putting in a lot of these low impact hydros areas where the water basically flows out to a turbine on the side of the river, and spins that to create electricity that they can then put out into the grid. And it's an option. I think that we'd have to really study it a lot before it was implemented. I think Kelly might have more to say about it. She might know more about it than me. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Actually, I don't. I mean, we did as a group. So the exciting thing is Sunvest Solar has been working with the Menominee Nation, just exploring some solar opportunities that exist within the community. We did talk about other renewable energy assets that the tribe had considered. Hydro is obviously one, but we didn't talk in depth about, what's occurring now, what the opportunities are, since that's really not my area of expertise. I will say, though, that Menominee Nation in itself is an amazing leader in Indian country in terms of the economic development and the assets that they have, and being able to do that with this really beautiful, delicate balance of environmental consciousness. And I think that, that's a strong point, and no matter what asset they're exploring, they're definitely going to be very interested in looking at what the impacts, both environmental and economic impacts. And I'm not familiar with the asset of hydroelectricity, but I know that if that's an opportunity, it's certainly something that the community itself is, going to explore, or at minimum look at the impacts and create some balance in that conversation. And I'm just reading some of the other comments.
One person's talking about, I think, what must be a fairly small hydro, I don't know, at Kennesaw Falls. But I do think some of the existing old, from the industrial era when mills were all located along creeks, that there are some micro hydros that can be restarted, especially if they have fish ladders and so on added. And the nice thing about hydro is that you can use it when the other things aren't going. So there's it's nice to pair it with other sorts of sources of energy, and even, someday maybe pump water up and store it behind these, or save it even seasonally. Especially with existing hydro, putting in new hydro is, I think, going to be difficult siting. There's a question about tidal power from Walter Robles. And I'm fascinated with tidal power and wave power for coastal communities, and the technology, we hear about advances, and then we hear that it's just not economic, or it's very difficult to install in a way that's economically viable. I think right now, really, wind is the cheapest thing out there, really the most affordable, and then also solar. So these are going to be, probably in specific places, could be very useful.
Well, and you raise a really good point, is that, and we talked a little bit about it, is that depending upon where you are in the US, energy is a very different conversation. So if we are in California, where the utility costs are extremely high, we are talking about, oftentimes these large scale, electrical shutdowns, where tribes are without a doubt in need of sovereignty or sustainable off-grid energy projects. It becomes much more viable when you're trying to pencil out batteries and storage and replacement and so on, versus the Midwest, where our utility costs are not extremely high. And so when we're talking about what projects actually work or don't work, it's really important that we realize that the economics play a role depending upon where we are in the US. Or in the world, for that matter. I traveled to Germany for music, actually, last year, and was so taken back. In both Switzerland and Germany, solar is everywhere, and not just solar, but battery. And that's a really common household requirement almost. So it was really thrilling to see other countries. And it'd be interesting, I guess I'm not an expert in that area, but it'd be interesting to see how those numbers played out and how they were able to, nationally deploy renewable energy in such a way that it became a household common rather than uncommon.
Well, and that was really national strong policy that was the result of the Green Party, having an impact on Parliament, and then it was durable. They just kept going, and we have them to thank really for the price of solar dropping, because they created that demand, and they paid a lot of money for that solar upfront.
Yeah.
Be much cheaper. I have one Menominee specific question before we move on from this, and that is the Menominee community is famous for forest management and sustainable harvesting of wood products. And so is there wood waste that's being used to generate electricity, and how does that fit in with the energy mix up there? And is that, can it be paired with other renewable sources? Because it is sort of what do they call it, a firm kind of energy that can be dispatched when you need it and turned off when you don't need it. Has anybody?
Yeah, sort of that like baseline energy, right? So so I think so there actually has been some investment in it at the tribal mill. They actually used some money from the stimulus back in 2008, 2009 to invest in a cogeneration boiler to heat and power their sawmill, and I think they cut their fossil fuel use by like 85% using that, and it's all running on wood waste. So so they have so much wood waste from sawing all this timber that they feed it into there, and apparently works really well. And I know that the Sustainable Development Institute is right now doing a pilot project using a pellet stove to heat their building. But I don't know the ins and outs of it. Maybe someone from SDI, if you want to talk about it, or.
I just came on in January, so I don't know that much about it, but I do know that we do have a biomass unit, but currently it's not working. It needs to be fixed, and for the part that's broken, they can't fix it. So that's kind of up in the air right now. But that's as far as I know. Maybe Jasmine can talk a little bit more about that if she knows anything. Oh, Rebecca just commented in the chat that the part is on order. So stay tuned for sure. We'll have that coming up soon.
Yeah.
So I see a question in the comments from Facebook. Just to start another question. So what do you think renewable energy in Indian country will look like in the next 5 to 10 years? Kind of like short term.
That sounds like a Kelly question to me, but just to.
I guess there's what I'd like to see, and then there's what's feasible and reasonable. I do think that the wave, not just for tribes, but nationally, utility companies, communities, local governments, everyone is setting renewable energy goals. Everyone is saying by 2020 or 2025 or 2030, we want to be, at 50% renewable, 90% renewable. Those goals are being, pursued all across the country. So you're about to see, I think, a much stronger commitment to the application of renewable energy worldwide, particularly in the US. And with tribes, as I mentioned earlier, I think, tribes have a stewardship. I think we grow up ethically as, even as a woman, to be a caretaker of the water of the community. And that comes with environmental consciousness. And that's just not corporate America making mistakes about burning fossil fuels. That's how we as individual members of our tribal communities and our communities as a whole can make a difference in the way we use energy. And so as that sort of ethic begins to migrate deeper and deeper into our communities, and we can see the impacts or the results of applying renewable energy, it is without a doubt going to become more of an asset that tribal communities are looking for. In addition to that, you see a lot more support on the part of federal, state, and local governments supporting and incentivizing renewable energy. The Department of Energy grant is a great asset for tribes to be able to take large-scale solar projects and make them pencil out even without the tax credits that are available to tribes. So with that being said, I think you're going to see a large boom growth in renewable energy in Indian country, without a doubt. The other thing I think you're going to see, and maybe not within 5 years, but certainly within 10, is a lot more tribes taking control over that asset in the form of utility company development, and also looking at ways that in whatever energy form, tribes can provide that economic opportunity to both their own communities, but outside communities. And that's all speculation. I certainly don't know for sure, but just from what I'm seeing and the momentum that I see when I meet with tribal communities, very few are saying, you know, we really don't want to do this. We're really not interested in this. So I think it's moving quickly. And I can see in terms of solar industry, I do see without a doubt that industry growing very rapidly, even particularly just here in Wisconsin.
I would just pitch in briefly to say something that I think is was at the beginning of your answer there, Kelly, that it's going to vary a lot, right? That there are some tribes and some communities, just like there are some states that are going to move a lot faster than others. And I just would flag up a really interesting book just released last week by a young political scientist named Leah Stokes, and it's called Short Circuiting Policy. And what she says what she finds in that book is, first of all, that a lot of this policy has moved from the federal level down to the states, and that in the states there were these renewable portfolio standards. That is, a certain proportion of the electricity had to come from renewable sources by this year, and then just incrementally ratcheting it up. That kind of snuck in under the radar for a lot of these utilities, but then the utilities got organized, these big companies that sell us our electricity and natural gas, and they have managed to fight off a lot of the continuation of those programs, that is them being strengthened, and then even rolled back some. And so we're seeing a real bifurcation that a lot of places are unfortunately stagnating. It's gotten a lot tougher in some ways to cite renewables because of some of this, what looks like local groups, but they're often funded and directed and enhanced by some of the fossil fuel and utility interests. I'm really sorry to be negative in this part of the story, but I think it's really important for people who care about this issue of climate change and the real advantages of renewable power not to be naive that we're going to, that we will inevitably, people will see the light of this great technology and this way to gain local power, that there are interests really whose whole business is based on selling something that is not sustainable in the future, but that their business model, they can't see how to get from where they are selling coal-based electricity or natural gas-based electricity to people, to how they're going to make money if everybody produces their own electricity. So anyway, just to say, to have tribes creating their own utilities, that is very exciting. I had not heard that before. That is very interesting. And I think a lot of localities are thinking about it now because they're having trouble dealing with their utilities. And I don't mean to paint all the utilities with one brush. Some are far more progressive and some are really, really regressive, but they are in every state capital lobbying, every day and using their influence.
Well, and one thing you had asked earlier, sort of what is the model of, for example, the larger solar arrays? Are they owned by a tribe? Are they leased? Are they, and every scenario is different. In Wisconsin, we have a significant number of utility companies who are migrating to renewable energy, who want to sell their clients renewable energy. And as a result, you're seeing more partnerships between public, private, local, and tribal governments, and some of which those cases are for a lease. A tribe has an asset, which is real estate. Utility company wants to be able to maximize access, and they work out, purchasing agreements where the tribe, has a benefit, the utility has a benefit, and everyone is getting renewable energy. So that's that circumstance. There's circumstances where tribes are putting in 1, 2, 3 megawatt solar arrays where they're actually selling power at a wholesale rate to, maybe a hydropower plant, which isn't able to create enough energy to supply. So they're buying wholesale from a wholesale provider. If the tribe becomes a competitive market in that area, then it's a tribally owned asset. There's also, other public and private partnerships. So I think the opportunities are endless. It's the conversations, and somebody needs to be able to share. I think what's really exciting about Sunvest is that we've worked nationally with tribes, and so we've had to tackle some really complex issues, whether it be just local, policies and utility policies and legislation, to, tribal taxation and the tax credit opportunities, to, just the barriers of real estate and working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We have had to come up with some really innovative solutions. So one of the, reasons why I really feel strong about our team is that we have some really great ways of being innovative. We can have those conversations. We can share some of the concepts and ideas that have been applied to our other projects, maybe things that tribes have not even considered as an option, and start having those conversations. I think what's really unique about tribal governments is there is a sovereignty model that is available. Tribes have a strong voice at the table. They're much more politically connected and much more sovereign in their ability to make their own laws and policies relative to energy. And so they become a much larger partner in the picture of renewable energy and just energy, United States energy sovereignty. I think that we're being underestimated in terms of our ability to be a national or international partner in those conversations. So I'll get off my soapbox, but I do think that there's some diversity in the project types that we're talking about, and no one size fits all. So if you're interested in learning more about, sort of the innovative approaches that we've used to creating utility scale down to small commercial size projects, please do contact me.
That's awesome.
Great. And I'm going to have to actually step out because I have another webinar, and my sincere apology. This has been very exciting. I've learned a lot, and I just want to wish you guys the best.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was very much appreciated. So enjoy.
So much. It was an honor, sitting on the panel, and I certainly learned a lot, and I would love to talk more with you. So
likewise.
Your next webinar.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Timmons. Thanks for doing this.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question, and I think this is one that everyone is a lot excited about. So we talk a lot about all these different projects in different locations, but what about here on the Menominee, well, not here where I am, but on the Menominee Reservation? What are some cool renewable energy projects that you guys are currently working on?
Yeah, I can start real quick. So I actually am working, as I mentioned, with Menominee, and we just actually installed last month a 10.24 kilowatt ground-mounted solar array. And so we had 32 solar panels donated by the Solar for Good program through Renew Wisconsin, and the rest of the project we funded through grants, but also we got tons of funding from large and small donors. And in terms of like time and effort, like the large private donors really helped push this over the finish line. Now, and that's not always an option everywhere, but as a 501c3 nonprofit, it was really useful for us. Menominee was wanting to go solar before I even arrived. So I kind of like took this and ran with it. So they want to do it as part of an effort to push for energy sovereignty in the Menominee community and really show that solar power is a viable option in such a northern latitude area. So the solar panels have actually, they're going to completely offset all of the electricity we use, which means that all the money we are spending on electricity is being funneled now into more programming. And with our efficiency upgrades we've been doing, it's actually, we're selling a little solar onto the grid, or we will be in the summertime. And this is really just the beginning for Mini-Conicum. So Mini-Conicum is actually in the process of building tiny homes to house those in need. First, because of COVID, to have a safe place to shelter for those who need it, and those who are lacking housing. And then, in the future, it's going to be there for other people even after COVID. So all of this is going to be powered by solar. I mean, that's our plan. And we've also been thinking about potentially doing like a small wind turbine, but that's something that we need to study more as well. But yeah, this was really exciting because Mini-Conicum literally didn't spend any money on this, and we got this installed, and it's only going to be providing electricity and benefits for the community from here on out. And the last thing is that we really want this to be a place for training people too, and for showing people that this is an option. So unfortunately, because of COVID, we weren't able to. We were planning on having this great ceremony and everything, and showing and doing a demonstration of how solar installations work. And we actually have been working with this small electric company called Eland Electric, and they actually have a program to train workers, and they said that they'd be willing to train Menominee folks in solar. So that's something that we're really excited about as well. So that's one thing that is happening in the Menominee community that I think is really exciting, and I can't wait for us to collaborate more to make more happen. So I'll end it there.
Yeah, Gregory, that sounds amazing. And I wish we had connected earlier in the year, because I feel like there's a lot of moving parts in the community that maybe just talking to one another would be really great way to build even a stronger, solar component for the community. I was blessed to be able to work with the Menominee Nation relatively recently, looking at maximizing the tribe's access to solar. As you know, Menominee is most known for their forested environment. So it kind of sounds like, oh, well, how are you going to put solar panels in a really heavily wooded area that is noticeable by satellite? And it was interesting because we were able to look at various different communities and buildings and try to figure out what really would have the biggest impact community-wise. And the community chose to look at residential as a potential asset, and Menominee has a utility sort of owned residential area that the community decided they wanted to look at how can we offset our costs. And so they are looking at a 250 kilowatt project that will be located in a residential community that will offset a significant amount of power. They're also amazingly having great conversations with the large utility company that is basically providing the wholesale energy currently cost at a cost. So we're working with them to come up with a more creative approach. There are some net metering limitations that are normally applied, and in this circumstance, the tribe is actually a wholesale provider, so they're able to work more directly with the utility company on a more government to government basis or government to commercial basis. So that project's been exciting. It also in concept includes, upgrading current infrastructure so it's more efficient and effective. And in addition was the workforce development component. So we wanted to work directly with the College of Menominee Nation and potentially look at training and certification programs that would further support the tribal members' involvement in installation, not just in the Menominee community, but it is definitely a career area that is growing, and we definitely need more individuals involved. And it's always nice to see Indigenous populations provide that workforce. So that would be, this holistic. Now we applied for the grant and it's not been announced yet. So we're fingers crossed and see what happens. But there is another Department of Energy grant, very similar to the previous grant award, which provides 50% match for any tribal project up to $4 million project. So it's very substantial. And that grant is due on July 1st. So there's nothing to say that tribal organizations cannot continue to apply for these grants and funds that will offset the larger costs of solar in Indian country. And we've been a great partner in assisting tribes in finding access to those resources and other incentives as well. So Solar for Good and other Wisconsin-based incentives. Well, thank you.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I think maybe, Greg, you can answer Lloyd's question really quick on the chat. Are the solar panels equipped with microinverters?
Yes, I believe they are. So come down sometime and check it out when we can leave our houses again.
Yeah. All right. Well, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us, especially our panelists. Honestly, we're so grateful for your time. I hope everyone has a spectacular rest of your Earth Day. Get outside, I don't know, take a walk, but socially distant. If you're able to pick up one of our tote bags from SDI, make sure to participate in our at-home scavenger hunt. I think the scavenger hunt is also on our Facebook page, and share your adventures on social media with the hashtag CMN Earth Week. Also, this is a very important discussion that we've just had, and to keep the conversation going on sustainable energy, you can join our Sustainability Learning Group Facebook page. Usually when we are not all quarantined, we have meetings every other week. So hopefully we can start picking that up soon, or maybe I can finally find a way to move that online. We'll see. So once again, Wawanan, thank you all, and have a good one, guys.
Wawanan.
Boannon.
Bye-bye.